everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. We don't have any announcements or corollaries today, so we'll just jump right in. Chapter 24. The Coral Kingdom. The next day, I awoke, feeling surprisingly clear-headed. To my great astonishment, I was in my cabin. My companions had undoubtedly been brought back to theirs while they, too, were unconscious. They would know no more than I of what had gone on during the night, and I could only count on chance future events to unveil this mystery. I thought of leaving my room. Was I free again, or still a prisoner? I was completely free. I opened the door and went down the corridor to the central companionway. The hatches, which had been closed the day before, were now open. I went out onto the platform. Ned Land and Conseil were waiting for me. I questioned them. They knew nothing. They too had slept soundly and had been equally surprised to wake up in their cabin. As for the Nautilus, it seemed to be as calm and mysterious as ever. It was cruising on the surface at a moderate speed. Nothing seemed to have changed on board. Ned Land scanned the ocean with his sharp eyes. It was deserted. The Canadian could see nothing on the horizon, neither sail nor land. A strong west wind was blowing, and long white caps were making the ship roll considerably. After renewing its air supply, the Nautilus dove and then cruised at a depth of about 50 feet, so that it could surface again quickly. And this was done several times during that day of January the 19th, completely contrary to the usual practice on board. The first mate would then go up to the platform, and the usual phrase would reverberate inside the ship. As for Captain Nemo, he did not appear. Of the other people on board, I saw only the poker-faced steward, who served me with his usual efficiency and silence. At about 2 o'clock, I was in the lounge, classifying my notes, when the door opened and Captain Nemo entered. I bowed. He answered with an almost imperceptible bow, without saying a word. I went back to work, hoping he would give me some sort of explanation about what had happened the night before, but he did nothing of the kind. I looked at him. His face looked tired. I could tell from his red eyes that he had not slept. His whole countenance showed deep sorrow and regret. He paced back and forth, sat down, got up, took up a book, put it down, checked his instruments without taking his usual notes, and, in short, seemed unable to stay in one place for a single moment. Finally, he came over to me and said, "Are you a doctor, Monsieur Aronnax?" This question was so unexpected that I looked at him for a moment without answering. "Are you a doctor?" he repeated. "Several of your colleagues have studied medicine. Gratulé, Moquin-Tandon, and others." "Yes," I said, "I am a doctor. I practiced for several years before starting my work in the Paris Museum." Good. My answer had evidently satisfied Captain Nemo, but I had no idea what it was all about, and I waited for more questions before saying anything else. Monsieur Aronnax, said the captain, would you mind treating one of my men? Is somebody sick on board? Yes. Oh, all right, I'll do it. Come. I admit, my heart was beating fast. I don't know why, but I felt there was a connection between the illness of a crew member and the events of the night before, and this mystery preoccupied me as much as the sick man himself. Captain Nemo led me to the rear of the Nautilus, into a cabin next to the crew's quarters. There, stretched out on a bed, lay a man of about 40, with a strongly moulded face, a true Anglo-Saxon type. I leaned over him. It was not a disease he had, but a wound. His head, wrapped in blood-stained bandages, was resting on 2 pillows. I removed these bandages, and the wounded man let me do it without uttering a single word of complaint, merely staring into space with a blank look in his eyes. The wound was horrible. The skull had been smashed by a blunt instrument, and the brain, which was exposed, had suffered considerable abrasions. Within this dissolving mass, blood clots had formed and turned to the colour of wine dregs. He had received both a concussion and a contusion of the brain. His breathing was slow, and occasional spasmodic movements would contort the muscles of his face. His brain was working more and more sluggishly, bringing on paralysis of feeling and movement. I took his pulse. It was intermittent. His limbs were already turning cold, and I saw that death was approaching, without my being able to do a thing about it. I dressed the poor man's wound, readjusted the bandages on his head, and turned to Captain Nemo. How did he get the wound? I asked. What difference does it make? He answered evasively. A collision of the Nautilus broke one of the levers in the engine room, and it struck him on the head. But what do you think of his condition? I hesitated to say what I thought. You can talk freely, said the captain. He doesn't understand French. I looked once more at the wounded man, then answered. He'll be dead within 2 hours. Nothing can save him? Nothing. Captain Nemo clenched his fists, and several tears appeared in his eyes which I would have thought incapable of crying. For several more minutes I observed the dying man as life left him, little by little. He seemed even paler beneath the electric light bathing his deathbed. I looked at his intelligent face, prematurely lined, probably through sorrow or misery. I hoped to discover the secret of his life in whatever last words might escape from his lips. You may go now, Monsieur Aronnax, said Captain Nemo. I left the captain with the dying man and returned to my cabin very moved by the scene that I had just witnessed. Throughout the entire day I felt sinister forebodings. That night I slept badly, and between frequently interrupted dreams, I thought I could hear far-off moans and a kind of funeral singing. Was it the prayer for the dead, murmured in that language I could not understand? The next morning, I went up on deck. Captain Nemo was already there. As soon as he saw me, he came over and said, "Professor, would you like to make another underwater excursion today?" "With my companions," I said. "If they'd like to." "We are at your orders, Captain." "Then, would you please go change into your diving suits?" There was no mention of the man who was dying or already dead. I went and rejoined Ned Land and Conseil. I told them about Captain Nemo's invitation. Conseil was eager to accept, and this time the Canadian also seemed anxious to go along. It was 8 in the morning. At 8:30 we were all dressed for this new excursion, and each of us had been given an air tank and an electric lamp. The double door was opened, and we stepped out, along with Captain Nemo and a dozen members of the crew, at a depth of 30 feet, onto the solid bottom on which the Nautilus was resting. A gentle slope led down to a rough bottom at a depth of about 90 feet. The terrain here was completely different from that I had seen during my first excursion beneath the Pacific. Here there was no fine sand, no underwater prairies, no marine forest. I immediately recognized this marvelous region into which Captain Nemo was leading us. It was the Coral Kingdom. Within the phylum of zoophytes and the class of Alcyonaria, there is the order of Gorgonaria, which contains the 3 divisions of Gorgoniae, Isidae, and Coralliae. It is this last group that the coral beings, that curious substance which was first classified in the mineral, then in the vegetable, and finally into the animal kingdom. To the ancients, it was a medicine, and to moderns, it is jewelry. But it was only in 1694 that Peysonnel from Marseilles finally classified it within the animal kingdom. Coral is a group of microscopic animals gathered on a brittle, rock-like polypary. These polyps, which produce these little creatures by a kind of sprouting process, and therefore provide their sole means of growth, not only partake of this communal existence, but also have a life of their own. This is, therefore, a kind of natural socialism. I was familiar with the latest work that had been done on this strange zoophyte, which, as naturalists have pointed out, slowly petrifies into tree-like shapes. Nothing, therefore, could have been more interesting for me than to visit one of these petrified forests that nature had planted beneath the sea. After turning on our Ruhmkorff lamps, we followed a coral bed which was in the process of formation, and which, with the help of time, would one day close off this portion of the Indian Ocean. Our path was bordered with thickly tangled shrubs, covered by little flowers, with star-shaped white lines. The light produced 1,000 charming effects as it played about among these brightly coloured branches. I thought I could see these tissue-like cylindrical tubes tremble beneath the wavy motion of the water. Small, fast fish would dash past like flocks of birds. I was tempted to pick the coral's fresh flowers and delicate tentacles, some of which had just blossomed, and others scarcely yet opened. But if my hand drew near these living, sensitive flowers, an alarm would immediately spread throughout the colony. The white blossoms would dart inside their red cases and vanish from sight. The shrub would change into a block of stony bulges. Quite by chance, I came across the most precious of all corals. It was as valuable as the kind taken from the Mediterranean off the shores of France, Italy, and North Africa. Its lively colours have justified the poetic names it has received in commerce: red coral, blood coral, and blood foam. This kind of coral is sold for as much as $50 a pound, and here there was enough of it to make hundreds of coral fishermen rich. This precious substance, often mixed with other polypores, formed compact, inseparable groups called macchiota, and on them I noticed marvellous specimens of pink coral. But soon the shrubs began to grow closer together, and the tree-like formations taller. Veritable petrified copses opened up before us, covered with shapes like girders of some fantastic architecture. Captain Nemo entered a dark gallery which sloped gently down and brought us to a depth of 300 feet. The light from our lamps would occasionally produce magical effects as it reflected off these sharp, rugged natural arches and off the formations hanging down from above like chandeliers, making them sparkle like dots of fire. Between these coral shrubs, I noticed other no less peculiar polyps: melites, iris and corallina, some green and others red, species of seaweed which become encrusted with calcareous salts, and which naturalists, after long discussions, have finally classified as in the vegetable kingdom. But, as one scientist put it, this is perhaps the point where life rises from its stony sleep, without yet detaching itself from its crude point of departure. Finally, after walking for 2 hours, we had reached a depth of around 1,000 feet, that is to say, the extreme limit at which coral begins to form. But here there were no more isolated bushes or low clumps of trees. We were now in an immense forest made of enormous mineral, plant-like formations, huge petrified trees connected by garlands of those elegant, magnificently coloured underwater vines called plumularia. We passed freely beneath their high branches, lost in the shadows of the deep, while beneath our feet organ pipe corals, brain corals, star corals, fungi, and caryophyllae formed a carpet of flowers studded with dazzling jewels. What an incredible spectacle. Oh, if only we had been able to talk to one another. Why did we have to be imprisoned beneath this mask of metal and glass? Why couldn't we be like the fish? Or better yet, like amphibians, who can live under and above water, according to where their fancy takes them. In the meanwhile, Captain Nemo had stopped. My companions and I also came to a halt, and as I turned around, I could see the crew forming a half circle around their commander. A closer look showed me that 4 of them were carrying an oblong object on their shoulders. We were standing in the midst of a vast clearing, surrounded by the high tree-like formations of the underwater forest. Our lamps gave off a kind of twilight, making long shadows on the ground. But at the edge of this clearing, the darkness became almost total, and was broken only by the tiny sparks given off from the live coral ridges. Ned Land and Conseil were next to me. As we watched, it occurred to me that we were going to witness a strange scene. I looked at the ground and noticed that in certain places there were regularly shaped mounds that betrayed the hand of man. In the middle of the clearing, on a pedestal of crudely piled up rocks, stood a coral cross with its long arms looking as if they were made of petrified blood. At a sign from Captain Nemo, one of the men stepped forward, took a pick from his belt, and began digging a hole several feet from the cross. Suddenly, I understood. This clearing was a graveyard, this hole a tomb, and that oblong object the body of the man who had died in the night. Captain Nemo and his men were coming to bury their companion in this resting place on the inaccessible ocean floor. My mind had never been so stirred. Never had such staggering thoughts invaded my brain. I did not want to see what my eyes could not help seeing. Meanwhile, the grave was slowly being dug. Fish scurried here and there as their retreat was disturbed. I could hear the pick resounding against the hard ground, occasionally shooting out a spark as it struck some piece of flint lost on the ocean floor. The hole became longer and wider, and soon it was deep enough to receive the body. Then those carrying it drew near. The body, wrapped in a white byssus cloth, was laid in its watery grave. Captain Nemo and all the friends of the dead man knelt down in an attitude of prayer. My 2 companions and I bowed our heads devoutly. The grave was then covered with the rubble previously dug out, thus forming a small mound. When this had been done, Captain Nemo and his men got up again. Then, going over to the grave, they knelt once more, and all stretched out their hands as a last farewell. Then the funeral procession started on its way back to the Nautilus, again passing beneath the forest arches, through thickets, and next to coral shrubs. Finally, we could make out the lights on board. Their rays guided us to the ship itself. At 1 o'clock, we were all back. As soon as I had changed my clothes, I went up on the platform with my mind full of all sorts of obsessive ideas. I went and sat next to the searchlight housing. Captain Nemo joined me. I got up and said, "So, this man died during the night, as I predicted?" "Yes, Monsieur Aronnax," answered Captain Nemo. "And now he's lying next to his companions in the coral graveyard." Yes, forgotten by the rest of the world, but not by us. We have dug the grave, and now the polyps will take charge of sealing it for eternity. The captain buried his face in his hands, vainly trying to repress a sob. He then added, "That is our peaceful cemetery, several hundred feet beneath the surface of the ocean." At least there, Captain, your dead can sleep quietly, beyond the reach of sharks. Yes, Captain Nemo replied gravely, beyond the reach of sharks and of men. Part 2. Chapter 25. The Indian Ocean. We now come to the second part of our journey under the sea. The first ended with that moving scene in the coral graveyard, which made such a deep impression on me. It made me realize that not only did Captain Nemo spend his entire life within the world's vast oceans, but he had even prepared his grave in one of its most impenetrable depths. There, no sea monster would trouble the last sleep of the Nautilus's crew, of those friends bound together in death as well as in life. Nor would any men disturb them, as the captain had added. He always showed this same fierce, implacable hatred of human society. As for me, I was no longer satisfied with Conseil's theories. He still felt that the commander of the Nautilus was merely one of those unrecognized scientists, full of contempt for a world which has treated them with such indifference. He still thought of him as a misunderstood genius who had been deceived by life on Earth and therefore taken refuge in an inaccessible region where his instincts could have free play. But to my way of thinking, this theory only explained one side of Captain Nemo. In fact, the mysterious events of the previous night, our being imprisoned and put to sleep, the violence with which the captain had snatched the telescope from my hands, and the man mortally wounded by some inexplicable collision of the Nautilus, all this made me look for other answers. No, Captain Nemo was not merely content to flee the company of men. His formidable ship was not only used to give him the freedom he wanted, but also to wreak some terrible vengeance. At the moment, I could see nothing clearly, just vague glimmers of light in the darkness. But right now I must limit myself to describing my thoughts as they were slowly formed by succeeding events. Nothing bound us to Captain Nemo. He knew it was impossible to escape from the Nautilus. We had not promised to remain on board. We were merely captives, prisoners who he called guests, just for the sake of politeness. All the same, Ned Land had not entirely given up his hope of regaining freedom. He was certain to take advantage of the first opportunity presented him, and I would undoubtedly do the same. And yet, I could not have gone without a certain feeling of regret, for the captain had been so generous in letting me share the Nautilus's secrets. And in addition, was this man to be hated or admired? Was he a martyr or an executioner? Also, to be perfectly frank, before leaving him forever, I wanted to finish this underwater journey around the world, which had already begun so splendidly. I wanted to see all the marvels contained in the world's oceans. I wanted to see what no man had seen before, even though I might have to pay with my life for my insatiable curiosity. What had I seen till then? Nothing, or almost nothing, for we had, so far, only travelled 6,000 leagues across the Pacific. I knew only too well that the Nautilus was sailing toward inhabited lands, and that if some chance of escaping arose, it would be cruel to spoil things for my companions merely because of my passionate curiosity for the unknown. I would have to follow them, perhaps even lead them. But would we ever get this opportunity? The ordinary man in me, deprived of his free will, longed for such an occasion. But the scientist in me dreaded it. At noon of that day, January the 21st, 1868, the first mate came out on deck to take our position. I went up on the platform, lit a cigar, and watched him carry out his task. It seemed clear that he did not understand French, for I made several remarks that, if he had understood me, would have evoked some reaction. But he remained impassive and silent. While he was looking through his sextant, one of the sailors of the Nautilus, that powerful man who had accompanied us on our first underwater excursion to Crespo Island, came to clean the windows around the compartment containing the light. I took this opportunity to examine it. It contained lenses which, as in lighthouses, increased its strength 100-fold and sent its light out in the desired direction. This electrical device had been constructed so as to give every possible bit of light. It worked in a vacuum, which gave it both regularity and strength. This vacuum also saved the graphite points between which ran the electric arc, and this was an important economy for Captain Nemo, for he could not have easily replaced them. In this manner, they scarcely suffered any wear at all. When the Nautilus was about to dive again, I went back down to the lounge. The hatches were closed and our course set, due west. We were then travelling through the Indian Ocean, that vast liquid plain which covers an area of 2,125,000 square miles, and whose waters are so clear that anyone looking down through their surface gets a feeling of vertigo. The Nautilus generally cruised at a depth between 300 and 600 feet. We went on like this for several days. For anybody but me, with my great love of the sea, the hours would have seemed long and monotonous. But my daily walks on the platform, where I soaked up the bracing sea air, the spectacle of these rich waters through the glass panels of the lounge, the reading of the books in the library, and the drawing up of my notes, used all my time, and left me not a single moment of boredom or weariness. All of us remained in perfect health. The food on board seemed to agree with us marvellously, and as for me, I could easily have done without the variations Ned Land managed to bring on board in a spirit of protest. Moreover, living at such a constant temperature, we did not have to worry about catching colds. Besides, that Mandriporaria dendrophilia, known in the south of France as sea fennel, and of which there was a certain stock on board, would have made an excellent medicine against coughs. For several days we saw a great quantity of gulls. Some were very skilfully shot and cooked in a special way, furnished a very agreeable dish of sea game. Among the birds which stay far from any land and rest on the surface of the ocean when they are tired from flying, I saw some magnificent albatross, which belong to the family of the longipennes, with their harsh cry, which sounds like a donkey braying. The family of Totipalmatae was represented by fast-flying petrels, which are so quick at catching fish swimming near the surface, and by numerous phaetons, or tropic birds, and especially the red-striped phaeton, which is about the size of a pigeon, and whose white body feathers, shaded with pink contrast, sharply with its black wings. The Nautilus's nets brought in several kinds of sea turtles, mainly hawkbills with their rounded backs and their highly prized shells. These reptiles can dive easily and stay underwater a long time merely by closing the valve situated in the end of their nasal passages. Several of these hawkbills were still asleep inside their shells when we captured them. This is the way they can rest and remain protected from attack by other ocean animals. The flesh of these turtles is not too good, but their eggs make an exquisite dish. As for fish, they called forth our greatest admiration when the mystery of their underwater life was unveiled through the open panels of the lounge. I noticed several species which I had not yet been able to observe. I will mention mainly the trunk fishes peculiar to the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the waters of equatorial South America. These fish, like turtles, armadillos, sea urchins, and shellfish, have a covering which is neither chalky nor stony, but made of true bone. Sometimes it is shaped like a triangle, and sometimes like a square. Among the triangular variety, I noted some about 2 inches long, with a brown tail and yellow fins, whose flesh is not only exquisite, but very healthy. I recommend that these fish be acclimatized to fresh water, a change which many saltwater fish can undergo with little difficulty. I also saw square trunkfish with 4 large bumps on their back, trunkfish with white dots on the bellies which can be tamed like birds, trigoniae armed with spines formed by an extension of their bony shell, and whose strange grunting sound has earned them the name of sea pigs. And then dromedary fish, with their large conical humps, whose flesh is tough and leathery. In Conseil's daily notes, I also noticed certain fish of the genus Tetraodon, peculiar to these waters. Spenglerians with a red back and white chest, which can be recognized by their 3 longitudinal rows of filaments, and electric tetraodons, 7 inches long and very brightly coloured. Then, among other genera, there were ovoids which looked like a brownish-black egg and had white stripes and no tail, porcupine fish covered with spines and capable of blowing themselves up till they formed a spiked ball, seahorses, common to all oceans, flying pegasi with their long snout, whose very large wing-shaped pectoral fins permit them, if not to fly, at least to jump up into the air, macrognathi with long jaws, splendid fish 10 inches long and brilliantly coloured, pale dragonets with their round heads, myriads of jumping blennies with black stripes and long pectoral fins dashing along the surface at tremendous speed, delicious vellifera, who can raise their fins and use them like sails to catch favourable currents, magnificent Curtidae, on whom nature has lavished yellow, sky blue, silver, and gold. Trichoptera, with their wings made of filaments. Miller's thumbs with their lemon-coloured spots, making slight hissing noises. Gurnards, whose liver is considered poisonous. Greenlings, with mobile flaps over their eyes. And finally, bellows fish, with their long, tube-like snouts. True flycatchers of the sea, armed as they are with a gun unequalled by chassepots or remingtons, which kills insects merely by striking them with a drop of water. In the 89th genus of fish, according to Lacepède's classification, and belonging to the second subclass of bony fish characterized by a gill cover and a bronchial membrane, I noticed a scorpion fish, whose head is armed with spines and which has only one dorsal fin. These are with or without scales depending on the subgenus. The second subgenus gave us specimens of Didactalia, 12 to 16 inches long, with yellow stripes and a fantastically shaped head. As for the first subgenus, it furnished us with several specimens of that strange fish called the anglerfish, which has a large head covered with ridges and bumps. It has spines all over its body, along with two irregular and hideous horns. Its body and tail are covered with calluses, and its sting can inflict a serious wounds. It is a repulsive and horrible fish. From the 21st to the 23rd of January, the Nautilus travelled 250 leagues, 540 miles, or in other words, it averaged 22 knots. During this time, we saw many kinds of fish which were attracted by the electric light and which tried to follow alongside. Most of them, though, were soon outdistanced by the Nautilus, but some managed to remain next to us for quite a time. On the morning of the 24th, we sighted the Keeling Islands at 12 degrees and 5 minutes south latitude and 94 degrees and 33 minutes east longitude. These coral formations, with their magnificent coconut trees, had been visited by both Darwin and Captain Fitzroy. The Nautilus sailed in close to the reefs surrounding these deserted islands. Its dredges brought up many specimens of polyps and echinoderms, along with strange shells from the sub-kingdom of the mollusks. Several precious shells of the species Delphinulia were added to Captain Nemo's collection, and I also added a spotted astraea, a kind of parasitical polypary often attached to a shell. But soon the Keeling Islands disappeared beneath the horizon, and our course was set to the northwest, toward the tip of the Indian Peninsula. "Civilization," Ned Land said to me one day. "It's certainly better than New Guinea, where there are more savages than deer. In India, Professor, there are roads, railroads, and towns with Englishmen, Frenchmen, and Hindus. Why, you wouldn't have to walk more than 5 miles to meet a fellow countryman. What do you say? Isn't it about time to part company with Captain Nemo?" "No, Ned," I said, in a firm tone of voice. "Let's let things ride. The Nautilus is going toward the inhabited parts of the globe. It's headed for Europe. Why don't we let it take us there? Once we're in our own waters, then we'll see what we can do. Besides, I don't imagine that Captain Nemo will allow us to go hunting on the coasts of Malabar or Coromandel, the way we did in New Guinea." Well then, monsieur, why can't we do without his permission? I did not answer the Canadian. I wanted no arguments. Also, at heart, I wanted to make full use of the stroke of fate which had thrown me aboard the Nautilus. After leaving the Keeling Islands, we travelled at a slower speed, and often very capriciously, often diving very deep, for no apparent reason. Using the ship's side fins, we occasionally reached depths of 1 or 2 miles, but without ever attaining the bottom of the Indian Ocean, which soundings of 42,500 feet have not been able to reach. As for the temperature at these lower depths, the thermometer read a constant 39 degrees. I did, however, notice that the upper layers of the sea were always colder in shallow water than in the open ocean. On January the 25th, the sea was completely deserted, and the Nautilus spent the day on the surface, with its powerful propeller striking the water and making it shoot up to great heights. This was undoubtedly one of the factors that made people think that it was a giant whale. I spent most of the day on the platform, looking at the ocean. Nothing appeared on the horizon until about 4 o'clock, when I saw a long steamer off to the west, heading in the opposite direction. Its masts were visible for a moment, but it couldn't have seen the Nautilus, which lay so flat in the water. I thought to myself that this ship probably belonged to the Peninsular and Oriental Company, which runs between Ceylon and Sydney, touching at King George Sound and Melbourne. At 5 in the afternoon, just before the rapid twilight which binds day to night in the tropics, Conseil and I witnessed a strange and marvellous sight. There is a charming animal, which the ancients said it was good luck to meet. Aristotle, Athenaeus, Pliny, and Oppian studied its habits and described it with all the poetry of Greece and Rome. They called it the Nautilus, or the Polymblius, whereas nowadays it is called the Argonaut. Anyone consulting Conseil would have learned from this worthy fellow that the subkingdom of the mollusks is divided into 5 classes, that the first of these classes, that of the cephalopods, which are sometimes naked and sometimes covered with a shell, comprises 2 families, the Dibranchiata and the Tetrabranchiata, distinguished by the number of gill plumes they have. That the family of the Dibranchiata includes 3 genera, the Argonaut, the squid, and the sepia, and that the family of the Tetrabranchiata only contains 1, the Nautilus. After this explanation, it would be inexcusable for anyone to confuse the Argonaut, which is acetabuliferous, that is to say, equipped with siphons, and the Nautilus, which is tentaculiferous, or in other words, equipped with tentacles. It was a school of these Argonauts, which was just then travelling along the surface. We could make out several hundred, and they belonged to a species which only exists in the Indian Ocean. These graceful mollusks move backward by breathing water in and then squirting it out through a tube. Of their 8 tentacles, 6, long and thin, were floating in the water, while the other 2, round and palm-shaped, were up in the wind like small sails. I could clearly make out their wavy spiral shells, which Cuvier so justly compared to elegant longboats. And the shell really is like a boat, for the animal inside does not adhere to this shell he has made. An Argonaut is free to leave his shell, I said to Conseil, but he never does. Je n'ai Captain Nemo, Conseil wisely answered. Perhaps he would have done better to call his ship the Argonaut. For about an hour, the Nautilus cruised amid this school of mollusks. Then suddenly they were seized by some kind of fear. As if at a signal, all the sails were taken down, all the tentacles pulled in, the bodies contracted, and the shells turned over to alter their center of gravity. Then the entire flotilla disappeared beneath the surface. It was instantaneous, and no naval squadron could have maneuvered with greater precision. Just then night came on, and the little waves brought on by the breeze died down peacefully around the Nautilus. On the next day, January the 26th, we crossed the equator at the 82nd meridian and re-entered the northern hemisphere. During the entire day, a formidable school of sharks followed the ship. That part of the world abounds in these terrible animals which make the seas so dangerous. There were Port Jackson sharks, with a brown back and whitish belly, armed with 11 rows of teeth. Eyed sharks, whose neck has a large black spot encircled in white and resembling an eye. Isabel sharks, with a rounded snout covered with dark dots. Often these powerful animals would rush at the glass panels of the lounge, with such violence as to make me very nervous. Ned Land was beside himself. He wanted the submarine to surface and give him a chance to harpoon these monsters. He was particularly excited by several dogfish, whose mouths were lined with teeth arranged like a mosaic, and some large tiger sharks, 15 feet long. But soon the Nautilus increased its speed and quickly outdistanced the fastest of these sharks. On January the 27th, off the entrance to the vast Bay of Bengal, we several times came across a very grim sight. Cadavers floating on the water. They were the dead from Indian villages who had been carried out to sea by the Ganges, and whom the vultures, the country's only morticians, had not finished devouring. But there was no lack of sharks to help them in their grisly task. Toward 7 in the evening, the Nautilus cruised half-submerged through a whitish sea. As far as one could see, the ocean seemed to be made of milk. Was it some effect of the moon's rays? No, for the new moon was still hidden from sight behind the horizon. Although the sky was lit up by light from the stars, it seemed black by contrast with the whiteness of the water. Conseil couldn't believe his eyes, and he asked me what caused this strange phenomenon. Fortunately, I was able to give him an answer. That's what's called a milk sea, I said. It takes place off the coasts of Amboina, and in these waters. But could Monsieur tell me, asked Conseil, what produces such an effect? For I can't imagine that the water has actually been changed into milk. No, my boy. This whiteness is due to the presence of myriads of tiny creatures, like little luminous worms, with jelly-like, colourless bodies, about the thickness of a hair, and less than 1/100th of an inch in length. These creatures sometimes attach themselves to one another over a distance of several miles. Several miles? Cried Conseil. Yes, my boy. And don't try and figure out how many that would take. You won't be able to, for if I'm not mistaken, some sailors have travelled over these milk seas for 40 miles. I don't know if Conseil paid any attention to my advice, but he became lost in thought. undoubtedly trying to calculate how many creatures 1/100th of an inch in length could be contained in a space 40 miles square. As for me, I continued observing the phenomenon. For several hours the Nautilus sailed through this white expanse, and I noticed that it slipped through this soapy water without a sound, as if it were in the midst of one of those frothy eddies sometimes seen between the currents entering and leaving bays. Toward midnight, the sea once again took on its ordinary colour, but behind us, right out to the limits of the horizon, the sky reflected the whiteness of the water, and for a long time seemed illuminated by the vague glimmers of an aurora borealis. And that, my friends, is where we will leave it for today. I hope you have enjoyed this reading. We got some more classifications from our friend Monsieur Aronnax and from Conseil, and we got to talk about some of my favourite creatures, the cephalopods. I love nautiluses and argonauts, cuttlefish and squid. I think they are the most amazing and alien and beautiful creatures in the entire world, and I always like hearing about them from someone else's point of view as well. I hope you've enjoyed our reading today and will join us next time on Soft Stories. But until we meet again, I must bid you all the best. Goodbye.